Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Town meeting of the LaRouche Organization for Saturday, March 27th. Last week's Schiller Institute conference, which hopefully many of you attended, has been reverberating in various ways in different parts of the world. That conference, which was called The World at a Crossroad, after the first 2 months of the Biden administration, had 4 different panels, and we'll be discussing different elements from the various panels. But there's this very specific process that was put underway there. And it was just recently expressed in something that happened, which we want to get right to today. The Schiller Institute had issued a declaration of China experts from all over the world. And it's something that was initiated by LaRouche. Yesterday, the Foreign Ministry of China referenced that it had taken note of that statement. I just want to quote from the Foreign Ministry Department of Information Director Hua Chunying. It was stated, "We have taken note of the statement. We believe that it represents and reflects the rational and just voice of the international community. And it is also a condemnation and opposition to the crazy words and deeds of some Western anti-China forces over time, such as disregarding the facts and attacking China and even falsely slandering. I note that the co-signers of the statement have hundreds of experiences or objective observations of China, dwelling with or having lived and worked in China, or who have frequently traveled and stayed in China for long periods of time. Many of them have witnessed China's great achievements since the reform and opening up, and observed up close the Chinese government's people-centered Chinese ruling philosophy, lifting up more than 800 million people out of extreme poverty, and recently witnessed the victory of 1.4 billion Chinese people in the fight against the novel coronavirus epidemic. I think their statement proves once again that what they see is true." Now, to discuss the character of what this, and by the way, the statement's available at the Schiller Institute website, and you can go there. There's also links that we'll provide for the statement for you. But to discuss the implications, both of what I just referenced, as well as the broader, if you will, implications of the conference as a whole, we're going to go right to Harley Schlanger. I think many people here are going to be familiar with him, and he's well known as a voice of the LaRouche Organization. So, Harley, let's go right to you so you can deepen our understanding of both this development and its context.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and hello, everyone. What I'm going to do is give you a background on what has been the policy of the Biden administration toward China, at least what we've been seeing in the last 2 months and a few days, and then discuss what it is that is so disturbing to the people who put Biden in office and who represent the international global establishment. What's so disturbing to them about the China Belt and Road Initiative? Now, to give us some background to that, we're going to take a look at a video from Lyndon LaRouche, which was played at the conference, but which gives you a sense of how Lyndon LaRouche and then Helga Zepp-LaRouche view the ideas of physical economy that underlie the principles of the Belt and Road Initiative today.
There are some practical considerations in this, strategic ones. And you'll see that the 2 focal points of this conference will turn out to be at the end as they are at the beginning. The issue of Eurasian recovery, Eurasian development as the pivot for world recovery, including the role of Russia as a very special part of any such recovery effort, and the relationship of this Eurasian commitment to the contrasting situation of Africa. In other words, to understand the world as a whole in the simplest terms of reference, look at the possibility of what we can do in Eurasia, and then look at the needs of Africa in order to see humanity in its wholeness. Those who have the means to lift themselves up, and those on whose behalf, in the larger term, they must act to lift them up too. Because the idea of the general welfare, while it's a notion of government of each nation, also must be a notion of the relationships among the nations of the world. We must find a community of principle in the notion of the general welfare, to unite nations for a common good. The common good is the general welfare of the nations, of the people in each, and of the community of nations as a group. It's the only chance for this planet. And in order to make this work, as has been understood for more than a century, almost a century and a half now, the only way this could be worked was to develop a system of infrastructural development which would effectively link the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean across Eurasia. Now, this is not railroads. This is not Silk Roads. These are corridors of development, corridors which run a range of, say, 100 kilometers in width, up to 100 kilometers, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, going in various directions, north, south, and so forth. Along these routes, as we did in the United States with the Transcontinental Railroad, that the area on either side of the transportation axis becomes immediately in and of itself a sustainable area of economic development. Then by that means you can branch out from the main corridors into subsidiary corridors of development and capture the area. If we make that kind of link, you have one interesting change occurs immediately. For as long as we know, mankind's economy has been dominated by the oceans. Contrary to all these theories that the British biblical archaeologists tell you, civilization did not come from inland and march down the rivers to the seas. It went the other way. Everything we know, especially the information on the internal characteristics of ancient astronomical calendars, shows that these astronomical calendars were predominantly the calendars used by a transoceanic maritime culture functioning a long period of time when most of North Eurasia was under a giant glacier for about 100,000 years. And during that period, most of what became later civilization was running around the oceans. And from the time that these maritime cultures came back into Eurasia, following the melting of the glacier about 20,000 years ago, when that began, was to move inland. And the first directions were to move along the great riverways inland, to move along the coastways, close to the seas and close to the maritime traffic. And if you look at the map of the world, you'll find the characteristic of development or non-development is the lack of the ability to utilize efficiently the inland areas, the landlocked areas of the world, with the same degree of efficiency and productivity we can use the coastal areas and the chief riverways. So therefore, if you look in Central Asia, what do you see? You see, here's the heart of it. In China, you have a coastal area of China which reflects this, which is more highly developed, relatively speaking, and inland, the area is poorly developed, the population has a poorer standard of living, poor opportunities for development. This extends then into Central and North Asia as a whole. Therefore, if we conquer this area, what happens? Take a transportation alone. People will think today, who don't think, will think that ocean freight is the cheapest way to move freight. It's not true. The cheapest way to move freight is across land, not by truck. Trucks running up and down the highway tell you that the economy is being mismanaged. Too many trucks. It's not efficient. Costs too much. Intrinsically bad. Railways are much better. Integrated transport systems featuring railways, especially magnetic levitation systems, are excellent. Magnetic levitation systems move passengers more rapidly, but magnetic levitation systems for moving cargo, for freight, that is really a wonder. That's where the payoff comes. If you can move freight from Rotterdam to Tokyo at an average rate of 300 kilometers per hour without much stopping along the way, And if for every 100 kilometers of motion across that route, you are generating the creation of wealth through production as a result of the existence of that corridor, then the cost of moving freight from Rotterdam to Tokyo is less than zero and can be up to 200 to 300 kilometers per hour. Now, what ocean freight system can do that? Did you ever see a large supercargo ship producing wealth while it was traveling across the ocean? And at what speed? So therefore, we've come to a turning point in technology, which have emerged over recent periods, where the development of the internal landmass of the world and the great typical frontier is Central and North Asia. It's the greatest opportunity, single opportunity, before all mankind for development. Now, this requires some revolutionary changes in the way we think about things. This means that we would be engaged in the greatest change in the environment in the history of mankind. This single project, say a 25-year or more development of Central and North Asia in this direction, including the conquest of the tundra. The Arctic tundra is one of the great frontiers to be mastered. It can be done. Would mean a great change in the environment. Now, how are we going to decide what is good and bad about changing the environment? Well, what people think today about the environment is pretty stupid. It's wrong, it doesn't make any sense, they don't know what they're talking about. And you see the kind of education you get, it's no wonder they believe that nonsense. Especially people with physics degrees who don't know which end is up. But the great theory of the environment was established by a Russian of Ukrainian credentials, Vladimir Vernadsky, with his concept of geobiochemistry. See, what you're taught, the problem here is you're taught in most universities and elsewhere about science is nonsense. It's a damn lie, most of it, to put it frankly. What you're taught as basic physics is mostly a lie. Because we know from, as Vernadsky demonstrated this in his own way, and others have known it and shown it, that there are actually three principles involved in man's physical relationship to the earth and the universe. Three categories. One, the category we call non-living processes. What most people who aren't well educated call physical processes. Yeah? The second one, which some people don't understand, those in molecular biology, they refuse to understand it. It's called the principle of life. You will never get life out of a non-living process. Life is, as Pasteur insisted, is a principle unto itself. But how it's a universal physical principle, which, as Vernadsky demonstrated with his biogeochemistry, is that the history of Earth is what? The oceans and the atmosphere were produced by living processes. Down several kilometers in the Earth's surface, most of the Earth that we are in touch with as humanity was created as a byproduct of living processes. What Vernadsky calls the natural products of the biosphere. We can measure it. We can measure the power of the biosphere over the non-living process. We can measure it. Living processes are superior to non-living processes. They're more powerful. They're apparently weak, but their long-term effects are more powerful than the short-term effects of the non-living processes. Now, there's a third thing, which, again, Kant won't let you know. Immanuel Kant. That's why they call him Kant, because he can't do anything. If you believe him, you can't do anything either. The essential nature of man is that we are capable of making discoveries of universal physical principle. Discoveries we can validate in known experimental ways. By applying these principles, we increase our power in the universe in ways that can be measured physically per capita and per square kilometer. We can measure this in terms of the demographic effect of this kind of action. That is, does the human species improve its life expectancy, its power to exist in the universe as a result of this? Yes, it does. That's good. Mankind actually is primary mastery of nature has occurred in terms of man's mastery and development of the biosphere. So actually, the biosphere is including what we call basic economic infrastructure, such as waterways, power systems, transportation systems. These are the development of cities, of good cities at least. These are natural products of cognition which are reflected as improvements in the biosphere. The biosphere is weak. It is stupid. It does not know how to deal with the deserts it has. It does not know how to deal with the tundras. It does not know how to deal with other problems that it has. But we as human beings can come to our poor, stupid slave, the biosphere, and say, we will educate you and we will make you stronger and better. So mankind intervenes in the biosphere to make the biosphere better. And so the principles of discovery, the application or discovery of principles applied to the environment creates the natural products of cognition in the biosphere, which improves the biosphere, which increases the potential for human life. So this is not a mysterious, arbitrary area. This is an area of science. It's an area of scientific precision, which would mean that the job to do is not to say, is it good or bad to tamper with the environment? It's very good to tamper with the environment if you know what you're doing. But you have to develop the science of water management, the science of transportation, the science of reforestation, the science of how to change and control the atmosphere and the climate. And that's what you can't make big mistakes. These mistakes will live with you for a quarter century or longer. You can't make big mistakes. Therefore, you have to have competent people, competent groups of people making the determination of how we do this. But by changing the biosphere of Central and North Asia and changing the biosphere in the arid areas of China and so forth, we will create the greatest boon for humanity in any part of this planet. What we need is a task-oriented mission task force to undertake the policy planning for precisely this, and it must be international.
What I intend to present to you today is why it is that what you just heard from Lyndon LaRouche is what is driving the fear of the Anglo-American imperial establishment, not the fear that they have of an aggressive Chinese military or a so-called autocratic regime in China, anti-human rights policy from China, all the nonsense that they throw up as their explanations for why we must be afraid of China and must mobilize against it. What they're afraid of is that what the Chinese are undertaking with their Belt and Road Initiative is a realization of the basic principles of science, philosophy, and economics that you just heard from Lyndon LaRouche, which is the revolutionary change of the world out from under an Anglo-American imperial doctrine of geopolitics and neoliberalism, but into an era of peaceful cooperation and economic development. Now, let me just begin with what the actual Biden policy is and what we've seen since he's been inaugurated. First, you had a series of meetings in Asia with the so-called Quad countries. This included meetings that Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, had with their counterparts from Japan, from Australia, and what Austin, the Defense Secretary, had with India, to pull together what they call the Quad, a potential military alliance to contain China, and to merge this with what is being done now to push NATO into the Indo-Pacific region. the North Atlantic Treaty Organization being deployed into the Indo-Pacific. An element of this was Blinken's trip to Brussels this last week, where he met with leaders of the European Union and with NATO, and supposedly reaffirmed their commitment to act together with the United States to contain China. An element of this was the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, and Canada agreeing to sanctions against China over the so-called human rights violation of the Uyghurs. And there's ample evidence to show that there is no human rights violation going on in Xinjiang province. Maybe we can get to that in the Q&A, but the story is a fraud cooked up by the same networks that claim that the Assad government was using chemical weapons against its own population. It's from the British Foreign Office as false flags as part of their assault against China. Now, in particular, I'm just going to review very briefly some documents that have come out in the last days from a group of think tanks that are essentially mouthpieces for the military-industrial complex, funded by corporations, funded by the Foreign Office of Britain, by the US State Department, by the Soros networks. These three institutions are the Atlantic Council, the infamous Council on Foreign Relations, and the Center for New American Security. The Atlantic Council put out something on January 28th called the Longer Telegram, which was drawing upon the initial long telegram from 1946, which laid the basis for the Cold War, as a strategy for containing China today. And it argues that, in particular, what should be done is to use a laser-focused drive to split the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party away from Xi Jinping. In other words, to conduct regime change operations inside China explicitly. That was in the Atlantic Council's document, The Longer Telegram, which came out on January 28th, just a week after Biden was sworn in as president. The Atlantic Council put out another one on March 22nd called the China Plan, a transatlantic blueprint for strategic competition. And again, this lays out in more detail what can be done to not just contain China, but to prevent it from succeeding with new alliances for development. And I'll go through some of the details of that in a moment. The third report was on March 25th from the Council on Foreign Relations, which was originally established in 1921 as an American-British think tank to coordinate the activities, the diplomatic activities of the US and the United Kingdom after World War I. Now, it continues to carry out the same function today, and on March 25th, it put out a report titled China's Belt and Road Initiative, Implications for the United States. Now, the third one, the Center for New American Security, it has constant seminars, forums, and puts out reports that are read by people in Washington. These three institutions are really largely responsible for shaping the discussion that goes on in the Congress and within the so-called permanent bureaucracy. Now, just to give you a sense of who the four people most important in making policy for Biden on China, you have Secretary of State Blinken, you have National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, you have the Asia czar at the National Security Council, Kurt Campbell, who is largely responsible for Obama's pivot to Asia, and then a man named Eli Ratner, who heads the China Task Force in the Department of Defense. And these four people have been with Biden, at least the first three have been with Biden, since his time on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the beginning of this century. Ratner's been involved with them on and off since about 2010. But the four of them are critical figures in the development of the China policy. At times, they present themselves as opponents of the neoconservatives, as a sort of softer version. Whereas Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and the military are essentially saying, build up the forces, get ready to go to war. these guys say, well, war is not the best option. But their approach could best be characterized as a carrot and stick approach. Now, Blinken was a partner with Michel Flournoy, who was the original choice to be the defense secretary. But because of her involvement, blatant involvement in the military-industrial complex, they had to drop her. But the two of them formed something called the West Executive Advisors LLC, which was a very important think tank set up in 2017 to, again, shape policy. It included a number of alumni from the Obama State Department and National Security Council. But let's go back a little earlier. Flournoy, in 2007, was the co-founder with Kurt Campbell of the Center for New American Security, which has in its board a number of people who are certified neoconservatives. For example, Victoria Nuland, who was the operative on the ground in Ukraine in 2014 for the coup there, who's a certified longtime ally of the what used to be called PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, the unilateralist approach to U.S. policy. The U.S. is the only country that should be allowed to make the rules. When she left the Obama administration at the end of the term, she went to the Center for New American Security, and now she's coming back as the number 3 person in the State Department for Biden. Now, this group has written a number of articles in recent years. For example, Campbell and Ratner wrote something, How Beijing Defied American Expectations, in the March 2018 Foreign Affairs publication, which is the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. What they argued is that the idea that China would change to become more Western if they were allowed into the World Trade Organization and were given a seat at the table, they argued that was naive, that China explicitly rejects Western liberal values, such as the market economy, and instead is going to continue to operate on the basis of state-driven economic policy, including with the Belt and Road Initiative, and that we have to recognize that that initial approach failed. In September 2019, Jake Sullivan and Campbell wrote an article called, again in Foreign Affairs, Competition Without Catastrophe, in which they laid out a strategy of how we could compete with China without necessarily going to war. But it starts with all the same assumptions that China is anti-democratic, autocratic, coercive, and militarily aggressive. But given that, we can still work with them. Now, in January 12th, Campbell wrote another article with a guy named Rush Doshi called How America Can Shore Up the Asian Order. I should tell you this co-author, Doshi, is with the Brookings Institute, but has written a book that's going to come out any day now called The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace the American Order. Now, the view of these four from these articles and from other public speeches they've given and other more articles than I can go through right now is that, yes, China has made extraordinary progress, especially with technology and with advancing the standards of living of their country, which is commendable. But that progress makes it a threat to the Western order, as they will not allow themselves to be integrated into the Western liberal order. This means they are, one, anti-democratic. Look at Hong Kong, they write. Look at Taiwan. Look at the threats. Look at Tibet. Number two, they suppress minorities, and this uses the fake report on the alleged concentration camps against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. You should know that the reason the Chinese have taken measures in Xinjiang province to address the Uyghur question is that a small grouping within the Uyghur Muslim population, a not so small network, I should say, were recruited by mosques in that area to go fight in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria against the United States on behalf of the terrorists. And then they were going back into Xinjiang province to try and undermine the Chinese government. That was the basis of the Chinese moving against it. But instead of shooting them and torturing them and blowing them up, which is what the United States did in Iraq and elsewhere, they were put in education facilities, taught trades, taught the Chinese language so they could be integrated into the society. And people who have been there to visit have said these are not concentration camps. They're more like the kinds of programs that were set up by Franklin Roosevelt for the Civilian Conservation Corps and programs such as that in the 30s. The next question. China is coercive. They have military threats against their neighbors. They use the Belt and Road Initiative to entrap nations into a debt trap and so on. And the fourth point that they make about China not being part of the Western order is they're violating the consensus on climate policy. That is, they violate the restrictions on carbon-intensive power, particularly coal, but also nuclear. That's something that's good. That's not a bad thing. So if you look at these things, you find lies, false flags, and attack on something that the Chinese are doing which is actually correct. The real argument they make is that China is assertive in its commitment to developing its population and its business partners around the world, the other nations it's working on with the Belt and Road Initiative, while the United States has been indifferent. So here's what they argue we should do. We should offer China three options. One is we can coexist, even peacefully, provided China plays by the rules of the rules-based order. And the particular case they're going to try and trap them into is the climate issue, which is not going to work because China is not going to go along with that. Secondly, we have competition. And what they argue is that the United States should rebuild its economy, which is obvious, but should rebuild it as a way to offer alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative. Alternative financing, alternative technologies, and so on. That's what's in the new Council on Foreign Relations report that I referenced earlier. And the third option is confrontation. You build up the alliances, build up the US military to have a conscious effort to counter what they call Chinese adventurism. Now, at a recent Atlantic Council conference just last week, Senator Dan Sullivan, an Alaska Republican who is now the chairman of the International Republican Institute, which was set up by John McCain to coordinate regime change with George Soros's networks, Sullivan talked about how great it was. Now remember, Sullivan's a Republican. He talked about how great it was that Sullivan and Blinken confronted the Chinese in Alaska. And he said, we now have a bipartisan consensus in the United States Congress that China is a problem and must be countered. And so what is the rules-based order that they're trying to impose on China? Well, this is the Great Reset. I won't go into the details because we've done that. That was a large part of what our conference was about. We have a new pamphlet the Schiller Institute does. It's coming out soon called The Great Leap Backward, which goes through the whole picture of what the Great Reset is and its relationship to the Green New Deal. But it's essentially giving the power of the world's economy into the hands of central bankers acting on behalf of private banks. Pursuit of free trade agreements that will benefit the global corporate cartels and to destroy the idea of the sovereign nation state. That's what the Great Reset is, and that's what they're trying to deploy as a means of roping China into an agreement for this. Financial regime change is what they call it. And what does that mean? It means no investment in economic production, going backwards in energy technology so there won't be enough electricity to sustain an economy that could even support 2 billion people, much less 7 billion. And to have all of this run not through elected governments, but through technocrats working on behalf of central banks. You think the Chinese are going to accept that after the progress they've made in the last 20 years? So what makes the Belt and Road Initiative such a threat? Well, you saw in LaRouche's video how the Belt and Road Initiative, this was before the Belt and Road Initiative actually, but what this idea of a land bridge, the new Silk Road, could represent. Now, I want to just present to you the beginning of a presentation that LaRouche made in Russia before the State Duma. Dave, if we can get the poster for this, because it explains exactly how this works. He's talking about what is the special role of large infrastructural projects. The three most critical bottlenecks in physical economy are cubic meters of usable water per hour, kilowatts of power per hour, and tons, kilometers per hour in general transport of goods, each of these three and all, per capita, per household, and per square kilometer of relevant land area. These bottlenecks have an obvious bearing upon the variability of potential relative population density. That is to say, technology being otherwise equal, the effective productivity which can be developed in one area as compared to another of comparable size and general quality varies with the degree to which those three infrastructural bottlenecks are overcome. Now, he goes on to say that in order to overcome this, we must speak of development corridors. That is, not simply connectivity by rail for the sake of moving goods, but for building new areas of development along what he calls a spinal column, that 50 kilometers on either side of that spinal column, which is the rail transport and highways and other kinds of communications, you have pipelines, power transmission lines, and parallel trunk highway connections. And that the whole point of this, of the Eurasian land bridge, and this is a speech he gave in 1995 to the Russian Duma, talking about the key to the Russian economy. He said, the general problem addressed by the land bridge is that low population density tends to increase the cost of production significantly. So as you develop this, as you increase the power, the clean water, the goods transportation, and use these corridors, or have within these corridors connection points where you build new cities, new developments, that not only are you improving the distribution of goods and the production of goods, you're increasing the relative population density of the whole area. Whether you're talking about Eurasia, whether you're talking about Africa, whether you're talking about South America, Central America, even the United States. The concept of corridors of development, which he took from Lincoln's Transcontinental Railroad, is that you're changing the physical geometry of a nation. And that physical geometry includes economic development, the living standards, the educational standards, the creative potential, the productivity, and as such, people live longer and the population can grow and its standard of living will constantly increase. That's LaRouche's conception of the world land bridge. That conception is in large part what the Chinese are operating with their Belt and Road Initiative. And that's what terrifies especially the City of London and Wall Street networks that are opposing this, with the arguments that China is all the bad, has the malign intent that you see in all the publications that come out. Geopolitics, which is their theory, their doctrine, is based on fixed static systems that can be put into conflict. That is, over declining raw material availability, over limited production. You can have a Darwinian universe, and that's the way you sustain imperial control, especially as a means of destroying sovereign nation states. But with LaRouche's conception of corridors of development, you transform the physical geography. It's important to note that the author of the original geopolitical doctrine, Halford Mackinder, was essentially a geographer. And his conception, which led to what we've seen recently with the Brzezinski Plan, with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, all treats civilizations and societies as static entities which can be moved into conflict and competition with each other. Once you actually overcome that with corridors of development, you create a completely new potential for cooperation based on the principle of increased productivity, increasing living standards, and improvement of the general conditions both of governments and of people. That's the threat, that instead of reducing the population as the Great Reset and the Green New Deal intend, and the intention of the people who set it up, from Prince Charles to Mark Carney to all the zero growth networks that have been publishing their documents since the 1960s, their intention is population reduction. This proposal shows what a fraud that is and how real economics works. That's why the Belt and Road Initiative is such a target for the people who are making the policy of the Biden administration, following in the footsteps of the geopoliticians like Pompeo, who destroyed the potential of the Trump administration to achieve better relations with China and Russia. And this is in the continuity going back to the post-1971 speculative system that was set in motion. So that's what I wanted to present, and I hope we can have some questions and more discussion on it.
Well, thanks a lot, Harley. Now we're going to continue our discussion about Lyndon LaRouche's unique view of the development corridors as a unique contribution, not only to the science of physical economy, but the science as a whole. And in order to do this, I want to have Diane Sare, who is a United States candidate for United States Senate in New York, running against the senator from Wall Street, Chuck Schumer, set up the next video and sort of give us a preface to that so we can continue this discussion. Diane?
Yes, thank you, Dennis. Well, what we're about to see is a short video presentation by Richard A. Black of the Schiller Institute on what China is doing in terms of their emphasis in their economic investments. And I just want to say one thing, which Helga Zepp-LaRouche has stressed repeatedly. She says, do you know who is the most popular economist in China? And many people might say, well, Karl Marx, obviously. No, it's Friedrich List, who was part of the American System School, although you could say the Leibniz American System School, whose work on the national economy was translated into Chinese in 1928, and who was in Philadelphia in 1827 at the Pennsylvania Society for the Promotion of Manufactures, where he said, quote, I herewith declare war against the system of Adam Smith on behalf of the American system of political economy. So the leading economist in China is an economist, a German economist who is in the same school of thought as Alexander Hamilton, as the American system. This is very important for people to know. And I think one way you might see this crazy propaganda campaign, which emanates out of London and the Wall Street and Hollywood controlled media in the United States, is they want to divide two great powerhouses who should really be old friends, and that's the United States and China. So I'm not going to say more right now. I think we can just go ahead to that video.
So China just announced a few weeks ago the outlines of their five-year plan, their economic plan for the coming period. There was a preview in Beijing where their top economics guys gave almost a 2-hour briefing on what they will release in early 2021, and it is a bombshell. So as you hear what they're doing, I think it'll give you pause for thought about what they're doing, what we're doing, and what we're not doing. So I would describe this as a bombshell within a surprise. Typically, of course, in the media, the Western media, this is not being covered. So I think you'll be interested in this. Number one, they announced their economic plan for the next 5 years in the context of just having eliminated 100% of extreme poverty. That means in every corner of China, the poorest areas, the rural areas, the mountainous areas, in a project over the last 20, 30 years of eliminating poverty, they have succeeded 100%. That's 1.4 billion people, no more extreme poverty. This is unprecedented in human history. And how did they do it? Well, people have heard about the Chinese high-speed rail. They built tens of thousands of modern rail, much of it high speed, connecting every section of the country, the poor areas with the rich areas, the inside areas with the coastal areas. There was a massive deployment of literacy, education. In the areas where the land was quite poor in quality, people were relocated into cities, and new housing construction lifted people up in terms of their living standards. And it was a very intensive effort whereby in the course of, let's say, the last 20 years, 2.9 million people were involved in the poverty alleviation effort. That is, government workers going into villages, towns, and house by house on questions of health, literacy, employment, economics, skill level. In one year, 2016, they counted 775,000 relief workers fanning out throughout the country, lifting up the population. So what does this mean? Well, it means that by eliminating the extreme poverty, you have a whole section of the population which before was adding nothing to the general economic contribution, now are making an important contribution, and the morale of the population is all the greater. This is a historic breakthrough. So that's the event. That's what occurred over the last several weeks. This was announced at the end of November, the beginning of December. Now, at the briefing in Beijing, what was announced is the 5-year plan will be based on really a single conception: innovation in science. And what they outlined is the fact that they are embarking on what they call a new development model. They said, we're not taking any model from the West or any other part of the globe, and we don't intend to export our model to any other part of the globe. We're developing something which is Chinese and which is unique. And what they outline is that they've made a strategic choice that scientific innovation will be the engine, will be the driver for the economy as a whole. Now, for those who are familiar with the breakthrough work of the American economist and statesman LaRouche, they will know that the idea of a science driver as the generation of value in an economy is absolutely central to a successful economy. So in the course of this 2.5-hour briefing or so, given by the key economists, they laid out why they made this strategic choice that science would be central. Interestingly, they gave no numbers, GDP, regionally, nationally, and for any of you who had to suffer through a college economics course or listen to the babble of the talking heads on TV throwing around numbers and GDP and supply and demand and this curve and that curve, in this briefing, no GDP numbers were given. At a certain point, there were about 300 ambassadors and media at this briefing. At a certain point, the Colombian ambassador to China got up and said, well, this is a little bit unusual. You're laying out your economic plan, but you give no GDP numbers. How is this possible? How can we trust that you, China, are going to do what you say you were going to do? So then one of the economists said, well, okay, let me answer this. This is a fellow, Dr. Xin, from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Here's what he said. I think you'll find this interesting. He said, China in the past had a lot of quantitative indicators for both economic and social development. Now, China is transitioning into high-quality development and is focusing on optimizing the structure of the economy so that people will focus more on the outcome of development and on quality. If we read between the lines, we can see the numbers and the quantities. The objective to become a leading innovative country means to become, for us, among the top 3 in the world. Innovation will take a higher share. And a culturally strong country implies a culture industry of 10% of GDP. That was the answer. Now, think about it. That is a bombshell. What the Chinese mean by cultural industry are the production of museums, concert halls, aesthetic education, literature itself, poetry, sports. Imagine a country of 1.4 billion people, 4 times the size of the United States, deploying 10% of its GDP on uplifting the cultural level of the population. Through what? Through leisure, through music, through art. And in fact, this bombshell by this team of economists, who are the government's top economists, is set within a discussion that has been going on for a number of years now, led by their president, President Xi, that the key to a productive nation is the aesthetical education of the minds of young people. Xi has often said, President Xi, in speeches, the task of a professor in his college is to create in the student a beautiful mind. That's how he put it. So this is there's a I can report to you, there's a lively, hot discussion of this question of culture, music, classical Chinese poetry, classical art, and the way in which by upshifting that will create value in an economy. I'll give you one example. At the Shanghai Institute of Technology, Dr. Yu Zhou recently published, a few weeks ago, a scholarly paper in which she takes up what should our educational policy should be in the high schools and the colleges. And she describes the approach to the teaching of art and the development of students. She says, Confucius combined artistic activities with the cultivation of people who meet his social ideals from the perspective of music education practice. He emphasized, quote, rise in poetry, stand in courtesy, and succeed in music. Starting from the ideological and artistic quality of music, Confucius takes goodness and beauty as the basic criteria for music evaluation, and he derives the perfect and the perfect aesthetic as an evaluation standard. Confucius also attached great importance to music education and proposes 6 lessons for study: ceremony, music, archery, horse-drawn carriage, reading, and math. Among them, music is the second. So I only reference this as an example of one of many, many voices alive in China about if we are going to become a prosperous nation and make a contribution to world science as a whole, then we must put a big emphasis not on money, not on building gambling casinos, not on the new version of Disneyland in Shanghai, but in the question of fundamental science, building a industrial base on the moon, mining helium-3 on the moon for their advanced fusion energy project on Earth, quantum computing, 5G, revolutions in agriculture, new species of seeds. This is the hot topic in China today. So culture, science, that's the discussion on outlining the 5-year plan. And of course, they make the point, which is a little bit shocking to us in the West. They say, we'll outline our 5-year plan, but only in the context of a 15-year plan and a 30-year plan. Where will that put us in 2050? So think about it. This is a standard, and in fact, I would put forward to you that this is the way America used to think.
Okay, so we've heard quite a bit, and I just want to start us off by saying let's have a little bit of a discussion about particularly the implications of what Richard was saying there on the cultural side. Let's start with you, Diane, about what you think about this emphasis that the Chinese are putting on the notion of 10% of the gross yield, gross profit of their economy going into a form of cultural research and development, so to speak.
Well, two things. One, I wanted to bring up something I was having a discussion with someone the other day about the relationship between the people of China and their government, because we've all heard the line, well, I love the Chinese people, but that evil CCP and Xi Jinping. And I said, well, to this person, I said, have you ever been to China? Which I have not, but several of our associates have. Helga has been there several times over many years. But I said, can you imagine a country where the people actually like their government? They trust their government. They have seen a transformation in their own personal standard of living in their lifetime for the better. And therefore, there's a certain quality of trust in the government that, and this is very, very hard for Americans to imagine at this point. So that's the first thing, because then you realize how foolish it is to think that you're going to get something in Hong Kong that Nancy Pelosi spoke so highly of, which was, these protesters burning down police stations and beating up elderly people and so on, the so-called democratic, Hong Kong movement. That is somehow going to destabilize or undermine Xi Jinping. It's just not going to happen. And similarly, what Harley was getting at about Afghanistan, where we really created a monster. We wanted to run a proxy war against the Soviet Union. As people know, the CIA created Osama bin Laden. We fostered and encouraged Islamic extremism and terrorism to fight the Soviets. And then these people all went back to wherever, in this case, the Uyghur population who fought there, and they were terrorists there. And then what is our approach to deal with that? Well, dropping bombs on wedding parties and funerals, which of course is what we were doing in Pakistan and Afghanistan and other places, which Somalia only serves to make people really hate you. So if you wanted to get people to really want to be terrorists, then try blowing up a funeral or a wedding party, which is what Obama was doing and what people like General Flynn spoke out against. So that's the first thing I want for Americans to reflect on. Imagine having a government that you believed was competent and that you trusted. I think that's crucial. The other thing I'll just say about the culture, look, in China, they have tens of millions of young people studying violin and piano and other instruments. You go to any conservatory in the United States, and if we don't begin doing, ethnic exclusion, you will see that in some cases more than 80%, 70, 80% of the students there are Asian, largely Chinese, and it's particular instruments. I found it's different for some of the woodwinds and brass, but violin, piano, certain things like that. And the audiences, imagine going to Lincoln Center and looking down in the orchestra section, and instead of seeing a bunch of gray hair and white hair and people coming in wheelchairs and so on, seeing an audience of 18 to 25-year-olds. Imagine a nation where the large audience for classical music, classical drama was young people. That's what you have, and I think it's tremendously optimistic. And that's not to say that everything is perfect. It's not, but that's where you benefit from a kind of friendly cooperation as opposed to what we're doing right now.
Harley, let me ask you about the observation that Diane was just making concerning the Uyghurs, this issue of terrorism. Of course, this in part would harken back to the days of the Islamic fundamentalist Kard of Zbigniew-Brzezinski and some other things. And you also referenced some things with respect to that, both in terms of Central Intelligence Agency and other American intelligence agencies. What's your view of that factor, especially as that factor may be, shall we say, informing American foreign policy right now, as at least it's been enunciated?
Well, there was a very fascinating article from the Gray Zone recently. I believe it was by, well, I'll remember the name in a moment, but it was on the person who produced the report, the one report that's cited by everyone on the so-called oppression of the Uyghurs. And this is a wild Christian fundamentalist who is creating these stories out of complete whole cloth. In other words, lies. And it's not surprising that this is being laundered through the typical British intelligence networks, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the BBC, Reuters, the same networks that covered up the real story about chemical weapons use in Syria, that there was no chemical weapons use in Douma. The officials of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, who were on the ground in Douma, wrote a report saying there was no chemical weapon use, and their report was ignored, and that was used to try and induce Trump to launch a strike, which he did. So if you look at this question of how intelligence functions, using false flags and lies for wars, you go back to the whole period of the post-war period, where the CIA, the various intelligence operations were involved in trying to create the idea of a communist threat in Western Europe in order to create NATO. Now they're talking about an Asian NATO to counter the alleged threats from China against their neighbors. And there are certain problems that still have to be worked out. The India-China border area is still something that's unresolved, although it's moving in a good direction. But most of the neighbors of China have to be pressured heavily to get them into an anti-China alliance. And this was the whole point of the pivot to Asia. The original documents that were used to justify this, and that was the part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and so on, the documents that were used to justify it argued that the U.S. is too focused on wars in Southwest Asia and the Middle East, and we've got to start paying attention to Far Asia, East Asia. Now, who got us focused on the wars into the wars in Southwest Asia? The same people who are now saying we have to be prepared for war with China. And just one other point on this. I know many of our viewers are very well aware of the fake narratives that were used in Russiagate against Russia, against Putin, against President Trump. But many of them fell for the stories against China. It's the same networks that ran the anti-Russia stories that are now running the anti-China stories. The same think tanks, the same media sources, the same writers, the same institutional networks, such as those connected to Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski was operating from British working papers, as was Kissinger before him, in shaping US policy in Southwest Asia. So the important point is that you have to ask the question, what is their real target? And what I presented in my presentation is that if you look at what LaRouche was saying, the greatest threat to this international oligarchy is that nations will reject the rules-based order, which is neoliberal economics, free market policy, free trade. These are not free. These are rigged games controlled by corporate cartels. And these corporate cartels act over and above the interests of sovereign nations. They subordinate nations to their court systems, to their financial trading systems, and so on. And that's the fight that we have to wage. So don't get tricked into thinking that what you're reading about China, it represents a threat to you in Iowa or North Dakota. The reality is the threat to you in the United States comes from the people who are telling you that China is your enemy. The Chinese didn't force the outsourcing of jobs. That was done by US corporations and US government policy, especially under Bush and Obama. So, this is one of these fake stories that is designed to create a constant turmoil in the world, regime changes, wars, crises, demands for austerity. The classic example of saying, don't look at what we're doing to you, look at what we say they're doing to us. And I think it's time for the American people to figure this out.
Yeah, there are two different people that were asking more or less the same question. I'll sort of just characterize what it was. This was the relationship between the upcoming summit that Biden is talking about doing, this leadership summit, which is on April 22nd, around the Green New Deal and the drive toward war, at least the war diplomacy, because it was noted that both Xi Jinping and Putin have been invited by Biden to attend, but he just called them authoritarians, killers, and so on. So I think the idea is, okay, there's this summit, there's a Green New Deal, there's all this talk. Is this something that will provoke war, or how do you see, this is, I think, mainly directed to you, Harley, how this process is going to clash between the Green New Deal and the need to keep things civil in the world?
Well, so far, the response from, I don't know if Xi and Putin have accepted the invitation, but their responses so far have been remarkably calm. Putin actually joked a little bit about Biden's calling him a killer, saying essentially the old playground story, it takes one to know one, and saying that if he says one thing to Biden, it's that he wishes him good health. And Xi, in spite of the nasty things said about him and his government and the Chinese Communist Party by Pompeo and others, and the continued provocations coming from Blinken and Sullivan, the Chinese are continuing to say, look, let's work, let's cooperate, let's do things together. Now, the whole green thing is one of the hooks that they're trying to use to undermine the Belt and Road Initiative, because they say the Belt and Road Initiative is too carbon based. It's a violation of the carbon restrictions they're trying to impose. But more importantly, go back to what Obama said in South Africa back when he was president. What are the Chinese doing? They're trying to provide an improved standard of living for some of the poorer nations that still suffer under neo-colonial policies, where they don't have credit, they don't have clean water, they don't have power and electricity. And the Chinese and the Russians are trying to provide that, the Chinese in particular, through the Belt and Road Initiative. And that's supposedly destabilizing to the world, which needs this climate change policy. And what Obama said to young South African students when they talked about their hopes to build up their national economy and to grow and have an American-style standard of living, and Obama said, if you have an American-style standard of living, the planet will boil over. In other words, accept your lot. You're not going to get it. And this is what the Green New Deal really is. This is what Prince Charles and the bankers really intend. No development. There's already famine threatening more than 200 million people in the world, according to the figures from David Beasley of the World Food Organization. There are wars, there's chaos, there's all kinds of threats that are being made against governments that are trying to develop. And so when the Chinese talk about the Green New Deal, they're talking about improving their air quality, their water quality, by developing more advanced systems, just as Lyndon LaRouche was talking about, that higher temperature burning processes produce less waste, that improvements in water management and power management enable you to not only have more efficient power systems, but cleaner systems, as opposed to sticking up windmills on every square foot of free space that they're trying to do. They're doing in Germany. They're trying to do it now in Texas. And look what happened when cold weather hit. By the way, cold weather in a period of global warming. So, the science is a fraud. The Chinese know it. The Russians know it. So do most scientists in the United States, real scientists. As Dr. Happer presented at our recent conference, the whole theory and ideology around climate change and man-made climate change is really a religious belief. It's not based on anything that's real, because he presented the truth about the need for carbon dioxide as opposed to carbon dioxide being a killer. So I don't think the Chinese and the Russians are going to go along with this. I don't think the Chinese will accept this as a hook, although they're probably willing to talk about it. The Russians are willing to talk about it. Putin just met with the coal manufacturing industry in his own country and talked about increasing coal shipments to Asia by 30%. That's hardly abiding by the principles of the Green New Deal. So, if they do attend the conference, it's important. But I think people need to know that Earth Day, which is the venue for this conference, goes back to Senator William Proxmire and his intent to mobilize the student movement, not against the war or not for economic development in the late 60s, but to mobilize it for population reduction, especially in the poorer sections of the world. So what we're dealing with is a question of increased potential relative population density along the lines of LaRouche's conception of corridors of development, which now is the underlying factor in the Belt and Road Initiative, or population reduction, or the less polite term, genocide. And I don't think the Russians and the Chinese will be willing to go along with Biden on that policy.
Okay, Diane, I think you've got a question there.
This question is, are China and Russia allied around the economic development you're explaining here today, or is Russia off by itself in this regard and kind of doing its own thing? To your knowledge, are Xi and Putin in regular communication regarding the provocative statements being made by Biden and his controllers? And I'd like to say a few things. Harley already partly addressed this, but the Chinese and Russians have discussed that they are having, among various levels on various projects, over 1,000 meetings this year. So I would say they're in fairly close contact on many matters. Russia they had, after the Berlin Wall came down, a terrible problem, this shock therapy from the British and the US of free trade looting, trying to use them for slave labor and raw materials, which Putin has partly addressed. I don't think there's still exactly the same clarity as there is in the Chinese in terms of what they're doing, but obviously they are collaborating. And also, in a peculiar way, these sanctions, and the Russians have said this, these sanctions that we keep imposing on them for things that they didn't do and were never proven, nonetheless have forced them to become self-sufficient in certain areas and to develop new kinds of production capabilities, which Putin actually has spoken of rather favorably. Not that the sanctions are favorable, but what they're finding is that people are able to rise to the challenge and rise to the difficulty. So they are in close collaboration, close discussion. Harley just addressed part of it. And it definitely is something that Americans should be aware of.
Well, let me just add to that. I should have made this point when I used that quote from LaRouche's speech from 1995. That was made in the Russian Duma, the Russian Congress, the lower house of their Congress. In 1995, the point at which the West was dismantling the Russian economy, creating a demographic crisis, which was written about by someone who associates himself with LaRouche's ideas, Sergei Glaziev, who wrote a book called Genocide, Russia and the New World Order. So this was directly understood by the Russians, what LaRouche was talking about. And while there's always been a somewhat of a conflict within the leadership in Russia over how far to go with the Western market economy, they have under Putin, and this is one of the reasons Putin is called an autocrat, because he's reined in some of the oligarchs he's reined in the Western bankers and has committed investment in the the investment will go into the physical economy in Russia. So that's LaRouche's influence in Russia. It's still very profound. In terms of China, Helga Zepp-LaRouche is very well known in China. She's known as the Silk Road Lady. She's spoken at a number of conferences and been invited to many meetings, is interviewed often in the Chinese press. And her point is not to go there and kiss the rear end of the Chinese leadership, but to keep pushing this idea of how the new Silk Road can become the world land bridge based on this principle of corridors of development. Now, Sergei Lavrov was just in China. The Russians and the Chinese are talking about all sorts of things. And one of the threats that's being made against them is that since they don't accept so-called Western liberal values, in other words, neoconservative policies, they may get cut off from the global transaction system called the SWIFT, which is how you if you need dollars, if you need other currencies, euros, you go through the SWIFT process, and there's a means of moving currencies so that you can carry out trade. This is being threatened now. And Biden's spokesperson the other day was asked about this. Is the U.S. actually considering, as part of the sanctions, kicking the Russians out of the SWIFT system? And she said, well, she can neither confirm nor deny it. She wouldn't really answer the question. She left it open that is part of the discussion. So what are the Russians and the Chinese doing? Well, one of the most important things the Chinese are doing is they're keeping the whole financial innovation, the derivatives markets, the speculative markets, they're keeping that out of their banking system. And that's considered unfair competition because they're not letting the swindlers who run Ponzi schemes come in and steal the money that's been brought into China as a result of the hard work of hundreds of millions of people over the last 20 years. You know, you got to realize China is considered a potential milk cow. This is why some of the discussion around the trade agreement between the Trump administration and the Chinese was about banking, because the Western bankers look at the money the Chinese have as a result of the balance of trade deficit, all the production in China that's then sold to the United States. The Chinese have a lot of money. And what they use that for is investment in new technologies, space technology, high-speed rail, and the Belt and Road Initiative through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and other banks, the Shanghai Bank, Cooperation Bank, and so on. Now, that's money the Western bankers want. The Chinese are not going to go into a speculative casino economy because they intend to continue to develop. And so this is one of the points of confrontation. And the Russians have a similar view because the Russians know very well what happened under the argument that they should open their economy after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism. They opened their economy, and people like William Browder and Bob Strauss, the thief from Dallas, were sent into Russia to buy up at a nickel on a dollar every bit of physical production they could, including raw materials, oil and gas, and so on. The reason Putin is hated as an oligarch, the reason people like Browder have done everything they can to slander him, is because he said, we're not going to let you dismantle our economy for the sake of Western financial interests. So Russia and China have a shared commitment. They're doing many things together. There's discussion of possibly making a military alliance if, in fact, NATO is going to send forces into the Indo-Pacific region. But I think more importantly, both Putin and Xi have stressed repeatedly that they're open for real discussion of cooperation and development. And remember, when President Trump was trying to do that with Putin, that's when the whole Russiagate story was launched by the British and the Obama intelligence community to prevent Trump from having any regular communication with Putin.
Okay, I know that Diane has some things she wants to say specifically about the United States with respect to these development corridors, but something else I want to make sure of, Harley. You referenced before William Proxmire. Were you referring to Proxmire or Gaylord Nelson?
Ah,
And
you caught me.
all right, well, that's fine because I
When
have
I was a
something.
student at Wisconsin, Dennis, when I was a student in Wisconsin, they were the two senators from Wisconsin, Proxmire and Nelson. What they
Yeah,
shared in common was a commitment to austerity, a neoliberal austerity when it came to government spending. Proxmire, especially, was known as a penny pincher. But yeah, I meant Gaylord Nelson, as you are correct to point out.
that's fine because I have a question for you, and actually I want you to respond to this, and I think Diane's remark she's about to make will probably be appropriately done here too. This is from an article from 2010 about Gaylord Nelson, Earth Day founder, which was Gaylord Nelson, disappointed in followers for neglecting overpopulation. By the time he died in 2005 at the age of 89, Nelson had become deeply disappointed with the wholesale retreat of the environmental establishment from advocating limits to population growth. Rather, a new generation of more pragmatic or expedient campaigners preferred to prattle on about safer and sexier topics like tropical deforestation, overfishing, oil and water shortages, and of course, climate change. In a March 2000 speech, Nelson warned that the U.S. could become as overpopulated as China and India. Quote, with twice the population, will there be any wilderness left, any quiet place, any habitat for songbirds, waterfalls, other wild creatures? Not much, he said. Chatting with Nelson before a 1998 news conference at the National Press Club, he startled me by announcing that when all was said and done, he considered himself a failure because the United States was moving away from, not towards sustainability, and out of control population growth was a major reason why. So I put that in because, of course, the Chinese rejected their one-child policy. And as you pointed out, Harley, in Russia, Sergei Glaziev made the observation that there were 1 million less Russians every year during the looting regimes of the 1990s, when in fact the transatlantic world failed in Russia in the aftermath of the fall of the wall. So maybe whichever one of you wants to start or wants to respond. Diane, you want to go first? You want Harley to go first? If you do this.
Harley can go ahead.
Well, look, I think Nelson was somewhat overstating the case. We have seen areas where we're seeing depopulation, including in the United States, from the the drug deaths, and so on, lowered life expectancy. But what's the real issue here? The issue that Nelson was pushing was in terms of dealing with this as a global question. If something is not done to deal with the pandemic in the poorer countries, including making vaccines available, if something is not done to deal with the famine that is spreading in parts of Africa, parts of the moving across the Middle East, if something's not done about the wars, whether it's the war in Afghanistan or the continued fighting going on in Syria and Iraq, we're going to see continued depopulation. But the idea that it hasn't been big enough yet doesn't mean that's not the intention. And part of the problem they had with this is that until I would say maybe 9/11, in the United States, most people did not believe that austerity and shutting down energy production and shutting down physical economy was a solution. People in the United States have always always been able to be mobilized around the idea of scientific and technological progress, that we can solve these problems through creative intervention, which increases productivity, which is what increases the potential relative population density. And so it was hard to sell that. And that was part of the problem they had. Unfortunately, in the last 20 years, given the wars, the endless wars, the financial crash in 2008, the spread of deadly drugs, the suicide rate going up, the mistreatment of veterans when they come back from wars so that they go into states of depression and the higher rates of suicide, we're seeing all the elements of an acceptance of this idea that we should have fewer people. So I think this has been somewhat of a reversal of the paradigm. And it's certainly the case in Europe, where you have very low birth rates. This is one of the things Putin was addressing, was inspiring the Russian people to start having children again. The idea that there is a future that can be better. So I think Nelson maybe was overstating the case and saying that it's not enough of an orientation toward this, but he's right about what his intention was. His intention always was to reduce the population. And that's why LaRouche in particular was singled out as a target, because not only did he identify who was for that, the networks of the British Empire and the global cartels, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, not only did he identify who the enemy is, but the solution based on this concept we've been talking about tonight, the corridors of development. So I think that's an important point that people just have to think about.
Yeah, so Diane, I didn't want to restrict you to answering this. Just wanted to put that out there before you made whatever response you were going to do on your.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Well, what I was reflecting on in terms of the United States and what Lyndon LaRouche said at the beginning when he was addressing the Russian conference, this question of development occurring from the oceans inland. And if the United States were to cooperate with China on the Belt and Road Initiative and to think about it this way, just look at the United States right now. Look at our port cities. In the New York area, you can take Manhattan, Long Island City, Elizabeth, Newark, Camden. You can take places in Connecticut. You can look at New Orleans, look at Houston, even Jackson, where they don't have any 40,000 plus people have no water or haven't had water for a month, which is an outrage. It's the Pearl River, which had been used for freight and shipping. So Los Angeles, I mean, you think about this. If you were to say, look, we should really develop our nation, and these ports are our point of communication to the rest of the world, where we should be exporting American goods besides merely importing goods from other nations that still believe in producing things. But then when you get to the port, how do you get anywhere? And in the United States right now, the average speed of a freight train is 17 miles per hour. I think in the 60s or 50s, it was 35 miles per hour. So we're about, I mean, talk about decay. And there are certain points, bridges over the Mississippi River, that are in terrible shape. I mean, you could have one disaster and shut down the ability to move goods across the Mississippi, just as we had terrible damage to trade by what happened with Hurricane Katrina. And you had people who were stupid enough to say, oh, well, it just shows that you shouldn't develop New Orleans because it's below sea level. I mean, try telling that to people in the Netherlands or Amsterdam, that you shouldn't have a city because it's below sea level. We've gone crazy in the way we think about it, but you could change the way you think about it and say, let's develop these port cities. Let's get our veterans out of these illegal wars, get them out of Afghanistan protecting the opium production, and get them over here and train a whole generation of younger people who right now are, if they're working at all, they're doing these gig jobs where you get an app and you're a dog walker, a babysitter, a driver, whatever. Let's learn some skills, have a career where the work you do when you come in is going to become more advanced, more challenging throughout your lifetime. Let's build new cities. We haven't built a new city in I don't know how long in the United States where you actually plan from the bottom up. We just have this very bizarre urban sprawl with these little, strip malls where one thing goes to the next, and it's wherever property is cheaper, so it's in the middle of flood zones, or it's really crazy. We're better than this. We've designed cities like Washington, D.C., or Paterson, New Jersey, and we could plan science cities. And I think we have to take a whole new approach to this, but thinking from the standpoint, it's almost as if your nation or your land area is a living organism, and you want the circulation of goods, of ideas, of culture, of people to cross-pollinate and to develop the inland. And in this way, we would become very good partners of China, of nations in Africa, of nations in South America, because we would actually have something to offer them.
Okay, we have a question. This from Jose, actually, and the irrepressible Jose Vega, who's got this question for you, Harley. Have countries like Japan and South Korea also developed rapidly because of a focus on physical infrastructure? I rarely hear them mentioned, and I'd like to know if they're involved with the Belt and Road and if they're still focused on physical economy. Did they take a similar approach to dealing with COVID as China did?
Well, there's a lot to that, but let's just start with the development of those two countries. Interestingly, Japan, modern Japan, dates back to the similar process that Diane talked about when she mentioned Friedrich List and his influence on the Chinese. You had Erasmus Peshine Smith, who was a collaborator of Henry Carey, who was Lincoln's economist, who went to Japan, and the Japanese had a rapid development in the period of the Meiji Restoration, where they modernized very quickly. And in spite of what happened in World War II, MacArthur reinstituted that kind of tradition. It was already there. And Japan has very modern infrastructure, modern technology. They were some of the early development of the modern steel process, which is much more efficient and produces less waste. South Korea also, very heavy involvement in infrastructure. Now, the problem is that they've been limited by the nature of geopolitics. For example, both South Korea and Japan would benefit enormously from working with China on the Belt and Road. But each of those countries, and look, when you look at the area where they live, you've always had this question of China, Russia, North Korea. Are these countries going to be impediments? Are they threats to South Korea, to Japan? And so the question is getting regional development perspective, which is one of the things that was being worked on towards solving the North Korea crisis. The idea of connecting North Korea, actually South Korea going through North Korea into the Eurasian land bridge would be a perfect example of that. Same thing with China, connection through Russia, Russia connection to the United States through the Bering Strait Tunnel. So many of these things are mapped out in the reports that we've done, which are available. People can go to the Schiller Institute or the Executive Intelligence Review and get the report, The Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, and you see how they would benefit from it. But this is where geopolitics comes in. Japan was targeted by the British at the end of the 19th century as a potential ally. And in fact, Japan was used in 1904 and 1905 to carry out a war against Russia that nearly toppled the Russian regime at that time. The war was a disaster for Russia. Japan was financed in large part by the British in that war. And the Japanese are being targeted now as part of the so-called Quad to be brought in as a military ally of the United States, Australia, and India as a counter to China. And South Korea is being targeted by the British with their global Britain. Boris Johnson has invited South Korea, Japan, and Australia to attend the G7 meeting coming up, I think, in September or maybe November. Well, no, actually, it's sooner than that. The G7 meeting is coming up, I think, in June. And what he's saying is let's include them in what's called the D10, the Democratic 10. Interestingly, where did this idea come from? The same Atlantic Council that I mentioned as one of the spear points against China, bringing in South Korea, Japan, and Australia into the G7, while Russia is still not included and China is not included. These are supposedly the leading economic powers in the world, but now they're trying to shift it to say, no, it's the democratic powers, so we can't have Russia and China. So you have this geopolitical push to keep South Korea and Japan away from the Belt and Road, and you have historic problems in the relationships in these countries going back to long before World War II, the Japanese invasions in the beginning of the 20th century into China. So this is where you needed a real dialogue, a real discussion process. And what the United States should do is encourage these kinds of discussions as opposed to looking for military alliances to contain and encircle China and Russia.
Okay, so I think we're pretty much at the end today, and let's just see if there's any summary remarks or anything that you guys want to say. Harley, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Diane.
My summary would be go to the schillerinstitute.com and watch the conference we had last weekend. This was an extraordinary conference. It put together many of the countries we're talking about. We had officials from Russia, from China, top officials, the Chinese consul general in New York City, one of the top-ranking Russians at the UN mission for the Russian Republic. We had representatives of governments from Syria, from Iraq, from Yemen to take up the question of Southwest Asia. We had an excellent section of a session on the Green New Deal, which included Dr. Happer, who was briefly a member of the National Security Council, and Richard Freeman, who wrote the article that's in the Executive Intelligence Review. So and then we had the whole cultural panel. Then we had a panel on fighting the pandemic by improving healthcare and nutrition, which included farmers and doctors. So it was an absolutely extraordinary dialogue, and we intend to have more of these. But I would recommend that people go and study the discussion process there, and then order a report, Great Leap Backward, and get an understanding of what a fraud it is that carbon dioxide is somehow the threat to human survival, and that therefore the Green New Deal is necessary. The Green New Deal is anti-scientific, it's crappy economics, and it's a policy of genocide. And once people understand that this is not just a question of AOC and Greta Thunberg being disturbed young women, but that they're actually being deployed to brainwash a population to accept this. I think once people get that picture, we're not going to have to worry about the Green New Deal or the Great Reset. So we've done some of the work. Join us, join the Schiller Institute, and become a part of this process.
So although Diane was about to give a summary, I think we just got another question, and she's going to try to answer it and do her summary. She's a candidate for office, so she has to learn how to do these things on the fly. So here she goes.
Well, a question just came in about whether we could say something about the blockage in the Suez Canal, which I think really underscores what we're saying about physical economy. I don't know why it happened exactly. We heard there was wind. It's a gigantic freight vessel, but it certainly does demonstrate once again how fragile our supply lines are. We don't seem to have much redundancy. This seems to be extremely difficult to correct. It was phenomenal what Egypt did actually in doubling the width of the canal and making it possible to have two-way traffic in the short time that they did. But clearly we now have, I don't know how many liners, 100, 150 vessels lined up, blocked, can't deliver their goods. I imagine some of these have things that may be somewhat perishable, and there are places that need these goods. It also underscores the foolishness of free trade and what's been done internationally by organizations like the World Trade Organization, where people are, as we heard from the farmers here in the United States, we're importing tomatoes from, I don't know, Mexico or Argentina, when a great deal of the United States has very suitable land for producing tomatoes, potatoes, fruits, vegetables, all kinds of things, but things are being shipped enormous distances, including things that are fairly routine that everybody should be able to produce locally. LaRouche used to say every nation has a right to have a full set economy that is a machine tool sector and ability to have a certain degree of self-sufficiency. So if you want to get a luxurious exotic fruit from somewhere or something that's produced as a specialty in another nation, that's great. And you can pay a little extra for it. You can pay the tariffs and you can have that. But the basic life necessities, you need to have as part of your regular economy. So we'll see how this unfolds. I don't want to speculate more, as I said, on what happened. And I would just like to say that we really have to liberate Americans from their wrong assumptions. People are bombarded by so much garbage in the media and the social media. And then what people, I think, tend to do is take a laundry list of which side they'd like to be on or how they'd like to be overheard or what they think they should think, as opposed to reasoning through and giving themselves a harder standard. Can I prove this? Does this make sense? Let me think this through from the beginning and forget who said it and see if I can reconstruct the argument in a way that I know it's true. And from that standpoint, I'd like to echo what Harley said. The conference, on my New York symposium last night, we did a hour and a quarter review, which is frankly absurd for 12 hours worth of panels. And what you realize is that what was presented there was of such high quality and so intense that you probably only took in half or less of what was being presented at the time. So I would encourage everybody who watched the conference, if you think you know what was presented there, I can guarantee you that you missed an enormous amount, and it's worth reviewing it as well.
All right. So, Diane Sare, Harley Schlanger, thank you for what you did today in this presentation. And of course, as was said, there's a lot that can be gained from taking a good look at that conference. Also, I think if Dave, we have the actual photo of the new pamphlet, The Great Reset Report. Yes, The Great Leap Backward, LaRouche Crushes the Green New Deal Fraud. This is available, or is becoming available, will be available over the next days. Get your copy in advance, but also know that on the course of the next weeks, we will be featuring the matter of the Green New Deal, the matter of Malthusianism, and the true nature of the climate change fraud on this in this program. We're going to close the day by giving a kind of sort of promissory note on an upcoming presentation. Diane mentioned, and of course we've talked about the fact that the very first panel at the conference was on the issue of culture. And specifically, we have referred continually to the idea that this is the year of Beethoven. Think like Beethoven is sort of the theme of this year. It's the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth. He was born in 1770. So 2020, he was born on December 16th, 1770. And so all this year, what's being done, at least by our organization, is to make sure that this concept of thinking as Beethoven did is made very, very specific. But there's something we want to say concerning Beethoven in China. And I want to refer people to this book, Beethoven in China. I don't know if you can see the cover there. Oh, there you go. Now I got better resolution. Beethoven in China. And it is written by Jindong Kai and Sheila Melvin. And this tells the story, which is that you do not have Beethoven coming into China as a result of Isaac Stern bringing Mozart or something after the Cultural Revolution. This is a much more established tradition and was synonymous with the idea of bringing revolutionary ideas into China, coterminous with what was being done by the Lincoln administration around the Transcontinental Railroad. And I'll say a little bit more about this in just a minute. But I want to just point out a few figures that are associated with this. The first person to write about Beethoven in China, to the best of our knowledge, was a man by the name of Li Shutong. He was a scholar, a kind of polymath. He lived between 1880 and 1942. And he became interested as a young man in Chinese politics at the age of 18. It was the time of a major cultural reform. He moved to Shanghai and he studied economics and Japanese under the educator Kai Yuan Pai. He was the president of Peking University. He worked with him at the Nanyang Public School. Shutong then went to Japan in 1905 and studied there. He wrote an influential article about Beethoven at that time in 1906. And he published it in a magazine I think he actually started, which was called The Little Music Magazine. It had one issue, and the issue talked about Beethoven as the sage of music. And Li Shutong, who was also an illustrator, did a picture of Beethoven, wild hair and so on. It became very well known in China. He wrote songs based on Beethoven themes, particularly the piano sonata in E minor, the Opus 90, the violin concerto, and the Ninth Symphony. And these songs were used in schools. So he was the first one that we know of that wrote about this. But it was an important Italian figure by the name of Mario Pacci. Now, this is a story that's quite interesting. He became involved in China in 1919. And the reason for this was that the colonial forces, particularly the French and British colonial forces, had formed a kind of quasi-orchestra called the Shanghai Public Band in 1879 to sort of entertain them. Now, these were all Filipino musicians, and they thought that they were inferior because basically they weren't white and they weren't European. And so they wanted to first kind of import a whole bunch of European musicians, but they couldn't afford it. So they had a German conductors and 6 German musicians for a while. That kind of worked for a while, but then they decided now they got to get a replacement because the conductor, Rudolf Buck, had to leave. And Mr. Pacci, Mario Pacci, replaced him. Now, he's sort of famous because he actually didn't get through the conservatory in Italy, but what happened was that Puccini heard him play the Appassionata and said, "Hey, you don't need it. I'll intervene." And so, as a result, what his examination was his playing of Beethoven, and on the basis of that, he got admitted to the conservatory in Italy. I think it was in Milan. I'm not certain about that. And he then went to China in 1919. He's notable and specific because when he got to China in 1919, Chinese were not allowed into the Beethoven performances, something sort of familiar to those of us who know about the peculiar practices of certain liberals at the Cotton Club in Harlem, where Black people were not allowed to come into the Cotton Club even to hear jazz. They could perform there, but they couldn't actually sit in the audience. And so what happened was that Pacci insisted he would not perform, he would not conduct, unless Chinese were allowed to attend the concerts. Now, that took him 6 years to do, but it finally worked by 1925. He taught his Chinese piano students to play Beethoven's works and became famous because at the time of when the Japanese occupied China during the Second World War and they shut down the Shanghai Symphony, what he did was in the last concert he was allowed to play to perform there, he sat down and played the Appassionata as he had as a young man. So the book Beethoven in China tells us the following. Again, this is the book. You can get it wherever you can find it. In 1860, a combined force of British and French soldiers looted the Qing dynasty's Yanminwan residence, a vast series of hundreds of palaces nestled among sprawling grounds that harbored theaters, temples, libraries, pavilions, gazebos, and galleries filled with priceless art, antiques, books, religious objects, and personal belongings. When the pillage was complete, the British forces burnt it to the ground. Foreign nations began to carve China up like a ripe melon, establishing concessions in which foreign laws prevailed in China for second-class citizens. And of course, later on, we won't get into this now, in 1900, 8 nations invaded China, including the United States. But earlier in 1861, when Abraham Lincoln took office, he established an American ambassador to China, despite the fact that China was subjugated at that time by the British after the Second Opium War, which had just concluded. And that ambassador was named Anson Burlingame. He became the ambassador to China's Qing Empire. And what's important about him is that he became so beloved of the Chinese that when his term was over in 1867, they asked him to stay and they requested that he become their ambassador to the United States and to Europe, which he did. What's important is to understand why that sense between the United States and China existed. The Chinese emperor had at that time after Anton Burlingame had come there. This is now taking us into a little bit later, about the year 1871. Dispatched a man by the name of Yung Wing. Yung Wing was the first Chinese scholar to have graduated from an American university, which was Yale. I think it was 1854 when he graduated. But he became the negotiator and the go-between for various business deals. And American machinery was purchased for what the Chinese called the self-strengthening movement. And what they did was that they built, together with the Americans, up the ports and the facilities of China. And they broke the free trade policies. The fact that the American manufacturing capabilities of American industry had allowed America itself to emerge from the Civil War of 1861-65 was one of the reasons that the Chinese had so much confidence in the United States. Again, as I say, this is a longer story to tell, but back to Beethoven for a moment. Beethoven was synonymous, and this is what Li Shutong emphasized as far as he was concerned, with the liberation of China. And because he thought of Beethoven having, as he said, he had to correct his compositions often. He was often struggling in various ways to write his music, and he was deaf, and he could overcome that. And so he used Beethoven as a metaphor. The other reason was, and he referred to Beethoven as the sage of culture, the sage of music. And this was a way of overcoming the Chinese habit of seeing musicians as sort of craftsmen, as workmen, as opposed to being true creative artists. And he admired the way in which Beethoven and other artists were seen in the West, and he emphasized that. Let me just maybe point out that, as I referenced, Britain, the United States, Germany, France, Russia, Japan, Italy, and Austria-Hungary all invaded China in 1900. And they were suppressing those movements toward an attempt to actually develop. Eventually, of course, by 1911, there would be a revolution led by Sun Yat-sen, who himself was also educated by Hawaiian missionaries and was a pro-American in the deepest sense. So that this idea of Beethoven in China and Beethoven today in China, as opposed to what you see in the transatlantic world, perhaps what we'll see is a resurgence of an appreciation of classical culture in the transatlantic world because of the power that clearly has of creativity that has helped to unleash in a China now more defined by science and technology than the transatlantic world from which it took inspiration to achieve much of what it is achieving. Now, Chinese society, Chinese culture is 5,000 years old. Clearly, the point was that this was assimilated, this new capability, but not in the way that people often like to say about the Chinese, quote, grabbing things and stealing them. No, it's actually possible, get ready for this, to assimilate an idea from someone else and make it your own. And to have that idea then become part of your culture. The concept that we have of the development corridor that Lyndon LaRouche pioneered is one in which that type of mutual, not merely win-win, but mutual respect for the culture and the humanity of another group of people, another language, culture, another nation, is the bedrock for physical economic progress and development and change. And it's this that the LaRouche organization, the Schiller Institute, and those associated with the economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche are focused upon and intend to make the dominant means of dialogue and basis of dialogue among nations at this time. Finally, I'd just like to say that on the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, which is the initiative that we have taken, which Helga Sepp-LaRouche has taken in terms of addressing the COVID pandemic, there will be approximately 5 weeks from now another conference. Stay tuned for that. That's the 1st of May. And we will have more to say about this in next week and the upcoming weeks. For those who are interested in these matters, just get in touch with us via our websites and through organizers that you're in touch with. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank you for joining us today. We advise that you go and take a look at that conference from last week and that you also get the report, The Great Leap Backward, and begin the discussion process that can allow you and fellow citizens to take the initiative to bring the United States, in fact, back to a true greatness that was represented by people like Lincoln, by people like Li Shutong, and the people like Lyndon LaRouche. Thank you and good afternoon.